I never believed in ghosts, until the night I worked the late shift at St. Augustine's Hospital. It was an old building, parts of it abandoned for years, and the night staff often whispered about strange occurrences. I thought they were just trying to scare me. It started around 2 a.m. While making my rounds, I heard soft murmurs coming from an empty room. I paused, listening. It wasn't the hum of equipment or the murmur of the ventilation system. These were voices. Faint, overlapping whispers. I stepped inside, flicking on the light. The room was empty. I shook it off and returned to my station. The hospital's silence felt heavier than usual, the air colder. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, buzzing softly. I glanced at the monitor, trying to focus, but a sudden chill ran down my spine, as if something unseen had passed right behind me. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the far end of the hallway. I knew I was alone in that section. Heart pounding, I picked up my flashlight and walked toward the sound. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit. The air felt dense, carrying a faint, metallic scent. As I reached the last door, my flashlight flickered. A shadow moved just out of sight. My breath hitched. I turned the corner, expecting to see a patient or a fellow nurse, but there was no one. Just an empty hallway lined with doors that hadn't been used in years. I exhaled, telling myself it was nothing. But as I turned to leave, something shifted in the reflection of a window across the hall. A figure stood there. It wasn't a clear shape, more like a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. It lingered for a second, then vanished. A sharp sound cracked through the silence, like a chair scraping against the floor inside one of the empty rooms. My pulse raced. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, the whispers returned, growing louder, overlapping until they became a low, urgent hum. A sudden gust of cold air rushed past me, and the door at the end of the hall creaked open by itself. My skin prickled. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station. My colleague, an older nurse, took one look at me and sighed. "You saw something, didn't you?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. She glanced toward the dark hallway. "You're not the first." I transferred to the day shift soon after. But even in the daylight, I sometimes feel a chill down my spine. And late at night, when the hospital grows quiet, I still hear the whispers. Even after I switched to the day shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the hospital was watching me. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, anxiety left over from that night. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. During my rounds, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find empty hallways when I turned. Call bells would ring from unoccupied rooms, and the security cameras sometimes flickered with static just outside the abandoned wing. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they chose not to. One afternoon, I was restocking supplies when I heard a soft knock behind me. I turned to see the storage door, which I had left wide open, slowly swinging shut. The air in the room had turned noticeably colder. I stepped forward, hesitantly pushing the door open again, only to feel an unseen force press against my shoulder, like a cold hand urging me to leave. The feeling of being watched grew stronger over the weeks, settling into my bones. Patients occasionally spoke of the woman in white, who stood by their beds at night, whispering words they couldn't understand. Some of them had never heard the rumors, yet their descriptions were eerily similar. One elderly patient, his voice weak, grabbed my wrist one evening and whispered, "She doesn't like when you ignore her." His eyes, clouded with age, were sharp with warning. "She remembers you." I barely slept that night. My mind raced with thoughts of that figure in the hallway, the whispers, the cold presence that followed me. But the worst came a few days later. As I was leaving my shift, I passed by a window near the abandoned wing. The glass was old, slightly warped, but clear enough for me to see my reflection. Except, I wasn't alone. A figure stood behind me. It was barely visible, just a dark blur, but I felt it staring. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, my reflection's lips parted, though I hadn't moved. And then, in the quiet hum of the hospital, I heard a whisper. "Don't leave me." I ran, refusing to look back. That was my last shift at St. Augustine's. I transferred to another hospital, far from that place, far from the whispers. But even now, in the dead of night, I sometimes wake up cold, the air thick with a presence I can't see. And sometimes, just before I drift back to sleep, I swear I hear it again. A whisper in the dark. "Don't leave me." Hospitals never scared me. As a night shift nurse, I was used to the eerie silence, the flickering lights, the occasional unexplained noise. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in room 306. It was my third week at Blackwood General, a hospital with a long history, one that included a fire decades ago, an entire wing left abandoned, and countless stories whispered among staff. I ignored the rumors. I had a job to do. One night, around 2 a.m., the call bell from room 306 rang. I frowned. That room had been empty for days. I grabbed my tablet to double-check. No patients assigned. Assuming it was a technical glitch, I walked down the dimly lit hallway to reset the system. As I approached, I felt it, a shift in the air. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle, like the room itself was holding its breath. The door was slightly open. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The bed was made, pristine white sheets untouched. The monitor was off, the four-stand empty. I sighed, reaching for the call bell to reset it, when I noticed the indentation on the mattress, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath. A whisper, soft, almost pleading, brushed against my ear. "Help me." I spun around, my pulse hammering, but the room was empty. The door creaked as a draft pushed through the hallway. I backed out slowly, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as I turned to leave, my eyes landed on the window. A reflection stared back at me. Not mine. A man, thin, pale, wearing a hospital gown. His hollow eyes locked onto mine through the glass. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. I didn't sleep that morning. When I returned for my next shift, I asked one of the older nurses about room 306. Her expression darkened. "We don't talk about that room," she said. I pressed on. Finally, she sighed. "Years ago, a patient went missing. A man recovering from surgery. He was weak, couldn't have gone far, but we searched everywhere. Security cameras cut out. No signs of him, no footprints, nothing. Just gone. But sometimes the call bell rings, like he's still waiting. I never went back to room 306, but others did, and the call bell still rings, even when the room is empty. I tried to avoid that hallway after my encounter, but the hospital had a way of pulling me back. The call bell from room 306 kept ringing, always around 2 a.m., always when no one was near. Other nurses refused to answer it, blaming a system malfunction. But I knew better. One night, a new nurse, unaware of the stories, responded to the call. She came back pale, trembling, refusing to say what she had seen. After that, the charge nurse ordered the room to be permanently locked. Maintenance cut power to the panel, but the call bell still rang. Weeks passed. I started sleeping with the lights on. Even at home, I felt uneasy, like I wasn't alone. Shadows stretched longer than they should. My reflection in dark windows felt delayed, as if something was watching me through the glass. Then the nightmare started. Every night, I found myself in room 306, standing by the bed. The man in the hospital gown sat there, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He never spoke, never moved, until the last night. In the dream, he finally turned toward me. His lips parted, and in a dry, rasping voice he whispered, "I'm still here." I woke up gasping, the cold air of my apartment pressing against my skin. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. A notification from the hospital system. "Call bell alert, room 306, 2 a.m. I transferred the next day. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, anything but what I knew in my gut. But sometimes late at night, my phone vibrates. A system error, they tell me. A glitch. But it's always the same message. Call bell alert, room 306, 2 a.m. I never liked working on the 7th floor. It was the oldest part of the hospital, with its dimly lit hallways and that unsettling quiet that seemed too deep, too unnatural. Most of the long-term care patients were kept there, but staff whispered that not all of them had truly left. One night, I was assigned to cover for a sick nurse. I dreaded it, but had no choice. My shift started smoothly, until I reached room 717. The door was slightly ajar. I checked my chart. The room was supposed to be empty, awaiting maintenance. Yet, the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. I hesitated before stepping inside. The bed was neatly made, untouched, but the chair beside it was turned toward the window, as if someone had been sitting there. A faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixed with something stale, something old. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like the weight of someone shifting in the chair. My breath caught. Slowly, I reached out and turned the chair toward me. It was empty. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Lack of sleep was messing with me. I turned to leave. The bathroom door clicked shut. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The silence stretched, pressing in on me. My shaking hand reached for the door handle. The second my fingers brushed it, a knock came from the other side. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The air grew colder, and a whisper slid through the silence. Faint, raspy. Not yet. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My colleague noticed my pale face and asked what was wrong. When I told her, she only shook her head. Room 717, she murmured. That was Mr. Caldwell's room. He was here for years, sitting by that window, waiting for his family. They never came. When he passed, he just stayed. I refused to go back to the 7th floor after that. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear about that room. A patient pressing the call bell when no one is inside. A chair turning toward the window, by itself. And always 3 slow knocks from the bathroom door. I tried to push the memory of room 717 out of my mind, but the hospital wouldn't let me forget. A few weeks after that night, I overheard 2 nurses talking in hushed tones. A patient had been moved into 717. A mistake, I thought, since we all knew that room should stay empty. But the hospital was overcrowded, and not everyone believed the stories. The patient was an older woman recovering from surgery. At first, everything seemed fine. Then the reports started coming in. She kept calling for the nurses, claiming someone was in the room with her. She spoke of a man sitting by the window, whispering to her at night. The nurses brushed it off as medication side effects, but then she started screaming. One night, around 3 a.m., she was found huddled in the corner, sobbing. She kept repeating the same words over and over. He won't leave. He keeps knocking. The next morning, the patient was moved to another room. 717 was empty again, but only for a day. The next person admitted lasted only a night before demanding a transfer. Then another. Then another. One evening, I was walking past the 7th floor when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I stopped in my tracks, my throat tightening. The hallway was empty. The door to 717 was shut, but I could feel something behind it. Watching. Waiting. The air around me turned icy. My breath came out in a soft cloud. Then, just beneath the hum of the hospital, I heard the whisper. Not yet. I backed away, refusing to turn my back on that door, and took the stairs down to another floor. I never went near room 717 again. A month later, they sealed the room. Maintenance claimed it was due to faulty wiring, but I knew better. Everyone did. But no matter how many locks they placed on that door, some nights, when the hospital is quiet, the knocking still comes. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the whisper. Not yet. Every hospital has a basement no one likes to talk about. At St. Vincent's, it was the old psychiatric ward, long abandoned, its halls left to gather dust and silence. The entrance was locked, the lights permanently off, but even now, staff avoided walking past it. I never had a reason to go down there. Not until the night I lost a patient's chart and had to check the archives, which, unfortunately, were stored in the basement. The elevator ride down was slow, the air thick and stale. When the doors slid open, darkness stretched before me, interrupted only by the dim emergency light flickering overhead. I stepped out, the floor cold beneath my shoes, and walked toward the records room. The silence was unnatural, too deep, as if the entire floor was holding its breath. I found the right file and was about to leave when I heard it. A soft shuffling. I froze, my pulse hammering. The security team insisted no one was ever down here. I swallowed hard and turned toward the noise. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the emergency light, a figure stood. My breath hitched. It wasn't moving, just standing there, tall, thin, draped in what looked like an old hospital gown. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally around it. Then, without a sound, it took a step toward me. I backed away, gripping the file to my chest. My mind raced. Was it a patient? A trespasser? I reached for my radio to call security, but before I could, the overhead light flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. I turned and ran. The sound of footsteps followed, echoing too close, too fast. I reached the elevator, slamming the button repeatedly, praying it would open. The cold pressed against my back, the unmistakable feeling of something just behind me. The doors slid open. I stumbled in, hitting the close button. Just before the doors shut, the light flickered once more, revealing the figure standing inches away. Its face obscured, its breath fogging the air. And then it whispered, "You don't belong here." The doors sealed, the elevator jolting upward. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. When I reached the main floor, I practically ran to the nurse's station. I told my supervisor what had happened. She looked at me, expression unreadable, and simply said, "Stay out of the basement." I never went back. But sometimes, when I pass the old stairwell leading down, I feel it. The cold, the silence, the presence lingering in the dark. And I know something is still down there, waiting. I never spoke about that night again, but the basement never let me forget. A week after my encounter, I started noticing strange things on my shifts. The elevator to the basement would sometimes arrive on my floor, doors sliding open to reveal nothing but darkness inside. Cold drafts slithered through the hallways, even when the vents weren't on. And then there were the whispers. Soft, distant murmurs that seemed to rise from the floor itself, just beneath the hum of hospital machinery. No one else seemed to hear them, until one night, a janitor quit on the spot, his face pale, his hands shaking. "They're still down there," he muttered before leaving. I heard them. A few nights later, I was alone in the break room when the overhead lights flickered. My radio crackled with static, then a voice, low, distorted, barely a breath. "You don't belong here." The same words I had heard in the basement. My stomach twisted. I turned off the radio, but the static persisted, growing louder, sharper. And then something impossible. The break room door creaked open. My breath hitched. The hallway beyond was empty, the hospital unnervingly quiet. But the cold, that unbearable, suffocating cold, poured in like a wave. I stepped out, my skin crawling. Down the hall, the elevator stood open, its button panel unlit. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard it arrive. I took a slow step back, but then, the doors started closing. And before they shut completely, I saw it. A figure standing inside. Tall, thin, draped in that same hospital gown. Its face obscured in shadow. Its head tilted, watching. The doors slid shut with a soft ding. I ran. That was my last shift at St. Vincent's. I transferred hospitals, left without explanation. But the basement still haunts me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, my phone buzzes with an unknown number. No messages, no caller ID, just silence. And if I press it to my ear, I swear I can hear it. A whisper crackling through the static. "You don't belong here." Night shifts were always quietest around 3 a.m. Most patients slept, the halls were empty, and the only sounds were the steady beeps of heart monitors and the occasional whisper of a nurse passing by. That's why I noticed it immediately when I walked past room 409. The bed was occupied. I frowned, checking my chart. Room 409 had been empty all night. It was scheduled for deep cleaning in the morning, no new patients assigned. Yet, through the small window in the door, I could see the unmistakable outline of someone lying beneath the sheets. The dim light from the hallway cast just enough glow to reveal the rise and fall of their chest. Someone was breathing in there. My first thought was that a patient had wandered in by mistake. It wasn't unheard of, especially with disoriented post-op patients. I pushed open the door, stepping inside. "Sir?" I kept my voice low, careful not to startle them. "Are you supposed to be in this room?" No response. I stepped closer. The air felt wrong, too still, too cold, as if the warmth had been drained from the space. I reached for the bedside lamp, fingers brushing the switch. The moment light filled the room, my breath caught. The bed was empty. The sheets, which I had just seen rise and fall with breath, lay flat and undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. A chill crawled up my spine. Slowly, I backed toward the door, my pulse hammering. I reached for the handle, ready to leave. Then, behind me, the bedsheets shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, as if something unseen was still lying beneath them. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I had seen. The charge nurse just sighed, rubbing her temples. "You saw him, didn't you?" I stared. "Saw who?" She hesitated, then glanced toward room 409. "That bed, a man died there months ago. They moved his body, cleaned the room, but well, some say he never left." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The rest of my shift passed in a haze, but before I left that morning, I forced myself to walk past room 409 one last time. The bed was still empty. But as I turned to go, I heard it. The soft rustle of sheets. The slow, steady sound of breathing. And then, barely above, a whisper. "Don't turn around." I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The voice was unmistakable. Low. Grating. Whispering. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Something watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The air grew colder, denser, and the familiar sound of the heart monitors from the other rooms seemed to blur into a muffled hum. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the ground. With all the strength I could muster, I forced myself to walk away, eyes fixed straight ahead. I could feel the presence behind me, the oppressive weight of it following me down the hallway. The whispers grew louder. "Don't turn around." I reached the elevator, my hand trembling as I pressed the button. The doors slid open almost immediately, but before I could step inside, a sudden, sharp click sounded behind me. The unmistakable sound of the door to room 409 opening. I didn't turn to look. I stepped into the elevator, quickly pressing the ground floor button, my breath shallow, heart pounding in my ears. As the elevator descended, I felt a heavy pressure in the air, like something was right next to me. The cold lingered in the corners of my vision, like the shadows were reaching out to touch me. When the elevator doors opened, I practically stumbled out into the lobby. The warmth of the main floor hit me like a wave, but even as I stepped out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cold was still clinging to me, that it was following me. I never worked the night shift at that hospital again. I transferred to another facility, far away from room 409. But the nightmares, they didn't stop. Every night, I see the same thing. A bed, empty save for the figure beneath the sheets. And a whisper, growing louder each time. "Don't turn around." I try to wake up, but no matter how hard I fight, I can't escape it. And I know, one night, I won't be able to stop myself from looking. I had worked the night shift in the intensive care unit for years, and nothing surprised me anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. Death was common here. Some patients recovered, others didn't. The air always carried a strange weight, as if something unseen lingered waiting. But one night, I realized something was waiting. It started with patient 12, an older man, unconscious but stable after surgery. He was unresponsive, barely clinging to life, but he shouldn't have been awake. Yet, when I passed his room, I saw his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop instantly. His monitors beeped steadily, but his breathing was shallow, labored. "Mr. Alden?" I said gently. His eyes didn't move. His lips barely parted, releasing a slow, rattling breath. "It's here." I shivered. "What's here?" His dry, cracked lips trembled as he whispered, "The shadow, by the door." My blood ran cold. The room was dim, but I could see the door clearly. Nothing was there. Still, the weight in the air grew suffocating, thick with something unseen. Then, his monitors spiked. His heart rate shot up, alarms blaring. I moved to call the doctor, but before I could, he gasped sharply and turned his head toward the door. His lips pulled into a silent scream. His body convulsed, just once, before going completely still. Flatline. I called a code, but the moment the other nurses rushed in, the air seemed to shift, the pressure lifting. The cold disappeared. We couldn't save him. As I stepped back, catching my breath, I glanced toward the doorway, and my heart stopped. The overhead light flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A tall, dark figure, standing just outside the room. Featureless. Hollow. Watching. Then it was gone. No one else saw it. No one else felt it. But I did. And I knew. It wasn't waiting for Mr. Alden. It was waiting for the next one. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. The stress of the ICU, the long shifts, the exhaustion. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling didn't leave. Over the next few nights, the air in the unit felt heavier, colder. The overhead lights flickered more often. The other nurses joked about the hospital's bad wiring, but I saw the patterns. The flickering always happened near the rooms where patients were close to death. Then came patient 14, a woman in her 60s, intubated after a cardiac arrest. She was unresponsive, her prognosis grim. But that night, as I checked her vitals, her fingers twitched. I leaned in. "Mrs. Holloway? Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Then, in a slow, mechanical motion, she turned her head toward the door. My stomach clenched. "It's watching," she whispered, her voice raw, almost not her own. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway. But the feeling was there. That same suffocating pressure. The weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back. I backed away from the bed, my heart hammering. The monitor beside her spiked. Her pulse raced, then plummeted. Her body convulsed once, just like Mr. Alden. The light above flickered violently. I lunged for the code button, but just as I did, the cold hit me like a wave. And for a split second, I saw it again. A shadow stretching from the doorway, tall and featureless. Watching. By the time the doctors arrived, it was gone. Mrs. Holloway was dead. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Standing in the hall, waiting. And then, as I lay in bed, my phone vibrated. A hospital alert. Code blue, ICU, room 9. My breath hitched. I wasn't on shift. I shouldn't have gotten that alert. And when I glanced at my phone again, the message had changed. It's watching. The room went ice cold. I didn't sleep at all after that. And I knew, whatever it wasn't finished. Not yet. I didn't go back to the ICU the next night. I called in sick. But it didn't matter. The presence followed me. At home, the air felt wrong, stale and heavy like the hospital's ICU. Shadows stretched longer than they should. The hum of my refrigerator sounded too much like a heart monitor's steady beep. And then the whispers started, soft at first. Just a brush of sound beneath my own breathing. Then clearer, louder, words slipping through the darkness. It's watching. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The shadow standing in the doorway, still patient. Waiting. Then the final sign came. 3 nights later, I got another hospital alert. Code blue, ICU, room 9. I wasn't even surprised. But this time, my phone screen flickered, distorting, as if something was inside the message itself. I stared, frozen, as the text glitched and reshaped into something else. You're next. The air in my apartment turned icy. My breath came out in white puffs. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing in my doorway. Featureless. Hollow. Watching. The lights flickered. The room pulsed with something unseen, pressing in, wrapping around me like invisible hands. My chest tightened. My vision blurred. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the sound of a hospital monitor, flatlining. Beep. And then silence. St. Augustine Hospital had a wing no one used anymore. It had been shut down years ago, left to decay, its doors locked and halls dark. But every night shift nurse knew the truth. The wing wasn't empty. One night, I found out for myself. It started with a patient's call button. Room 233. The problem? Room 233 was in the abandoned wing. There hadn't been a patient in that room for over a decade. Thinking it was a glitch, I ignored it. But an hour later, the button lit up again. This time, the call alert included something else. A voice. Static-filled, barely audible, but there whispering. Help me. My stomach twisted. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about this felt wrong. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and took the long hallway toward the forgotten wing. The air grew colder with every step. Dust coated the floors, the walls peeling with age. At the end of the hall, room 233's light flickered weakly. The door was slightly open. I hesitated, then pushed it wider. Inside, the bed was perfectly made, as if waiting for a patient. The air smelled of antiseptic, fresh, like someone had just been here. My skin prickled as I stepped inside. Then I saw the wheelchair. It sat in the corner, old and rusted, facing the window. A thick layer of dust covered it, except for the seat, which looked recently disturbed. A scrape echoed behind me. I spun around. The wheelchair had moved. It was now facing me. My breath caught. My flashlight flickered, the air pressing down like unseen hands. And then just behind me, a voice. Soft, hoarse, impossibly close. Help me. I turned and ran. The hallway felt longer, stretching endlessly. Behind me, I heard the wheelchair scraping against the floor, moving on its own. The air grew thick with whispers, overlapping voices murmuring in agony. Then, just as I reached the locked doors, a cold, invisible hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed, yanking free, stumbling into the main hospital. The warmth of the lights hit me like a wave, and when I turned back, the hallway was empty. The door to the forgotten wing stood shut. I never went back, but sometimes late at night, room 233's call button still lights up. And if you listen closely beneath the static, you can still hear the whisper. Help me. I tried to forget what happened in the abandoned wing. I told no one, convinced myself it was exhaustion, a trick of my tired mind. But the hospital wouldn't let me forget. The next night, room 233 called again. This time, I wasn't the only one who noticed. That wing is supposed to be sealed, my coworker Lisa muttered, staring at the flashing alert on the monitor. How is this happening? I swallowed hard. I didn't want to answer. The charge nurse reset the call system, silencing the alert. Glitch, she said firmly, though her voice lacked conviction. Ignore it. But we couldn't. An hour later, it happened again. And this time, the hospital's security cameras caught something. A live feed from the abandoned wings. Hallway showed room 233's door slowly creaking open on its own. No one was there. No one living, anyway. The charge nurse turned pale. I'll call maintenance, she stammered. But I saw the look in her eyes. She knew. We all did. Then the temperature dropped. A wave of cold swept through the station. Our radios crackled with static. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. And then, the call button for room 233 lit up again. And a voice, clear this time, broke through the static. Help me. It's coming. Lisa and I stared at each other, dread twisting in my gut. It's coming? Something slammed. Loud. Violent. Like a door being thrown open. The sound came from the direction of the abandoned wing. Lisa grabbed my arm. We need to go. We ran. Behind us, the hallway stretched, the shadows warping unnaturally. The whispers started again, growing louder. Help me. It's coming. Run. We reached the stairwell, throwing the door open. As we rushed down, I glanced back, and I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall, just outside room 233. Tall, featureless, watching. The lights cut out completely. We didn't stop running until we reached the ER, breathless and shaking. That was my last night at St. Augustine. I quit the next day. But even now, I can't escape it. I wake up to my phone vibrating at 3 a.m. No caller ID. No messages. Just a missed alert. Room 233, call button pressed. And if I listen closely, I can still hear the whisper. Help me. It's coming. I threw my phone across the room. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to see it. But it didn't matter. The next night, the call came again. This time I answered. Static filled my ear, thick and suffocating. My breath hitched as the whisper came through, barely audible, yet unmistakably there. Help me. It's here. Then, something else. A sound behind the voice. A deep, guttural breathing. I hung up. My apartment turned ice cold. The air pressed down like invisible hands, wrapping around my throat. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. My lights flickered, the bulbs humming, straining. And then, a soft creak from the hallway. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned toward my bedroom door. It was open. I always closed it. A shadow loomed just beyond the doorway. Too tall. Too still. Watching. The lights cut out completely. The breathing grew louder. Closer. My phone buzzed one last time. The screen flickered, a final message appearing through the static. It found you. A hand, cold, skeletal, clamped around my wrist. And then, nothing. I never believed the stories about St. Mary's Hospital. The other nurses whispered about strange happenings on the 6th floor, the one that had been permanently closed after a fire 20 years ago. They said it was still haunted, that sometimes at night, the elevator would take you there even if you never pressed the button. I always rolled my eyes. Hospitals had creaky floors, flickering lights, and weird noises. That didn't mean they were haunted. Then one night, I found out the stories were true. It was just past 2 a.m. when I stepped into the staff elevator, heading down to the cafeteria for a coffee break. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and the elevator hummed softly as it descended. Then, without warning, it stopped. Not on the ground floor. Not on any active level. The glowing red numbers above the door flashed 6. My stomach twisted. The 6th floor didn't exist anymore, not officially. The doors shouldn't open. There was nothing there. But with a soft ding, they slid apart. A wave of stale, smoke-tainted air washed over me. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering weakly. The walls were charred, peeling, like the fire had only happened yesterday. And the worst part? The hospital smelled alive. Not like an abandoned wing. There was no dust. No decay. The air was thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic. I knew I should stay in the elevator. Press the close button. Leave. But something pulled at me. I stepped out. The moment my foot touched the floor, the elevator dinged again, louder this time, urgent. The doors slammed shut behind me. I spun around, pressing the button frantically. Nothing. The call panel was dead. A chill crawled up my spine. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, impossibly long, lined with patient rooms. Some doors stood ajar. Others were sealed tight. A flickering sign on the wall read, "Intensive Care, 6th floor." A whisper echoed from one of the rooms. My heart pounded. I wasn't alone. I took slow, cautious steps down the hallway, peering into one of the open rooms. The bed was made. The monitor beside it blinked weakly, as if it were still hooked up to a patient. Then from further down the hall, I heard it. A slow, rhythmic beeping. A heart monitor. The sound sent ice through my veins. There were no working machines up here, but something was still alive. I followed the sound, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The door at the end of the hall was wide open, light spilling into the corridor. Inside, a single hospital bed sat in the center of the room, and someone was lying in it. The figure was motionless, covered in a thin white sheet. A breathing tube rested in their mouth, connected to a ventilator that wasn't plugged into anything. The monitor beside them showed a steady, strong heartbeat. Beep, beep, beep. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. The air around the bed was freezing. My breath came out in misty clouds. Then suddenly, the heartbeat on the monitor stopped. Flatline. The room went silent. The figure under the sheet sat up. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The sheet slid off slowly, revealing a gaunt, hollow face, skin burned and cracked, eyes sunken and black as pits. It opened its mouth, and a rasping whisper escaped. "You don't belong here." The lights overhead burst, plunging the room into darkness. I ran. Down the hall, past the empty rooms, the whispers rising all around me. My footsteps pounded against the floor, but the hallway seemed endless, stretching on and on. Then up ahead, the elevator. Its doors stood open, waiting. I threw myself inside, slamming the close button. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the doors slid shut. The elevator jolted, descending fast. My pulse raced, my mind barely able to process what I had seen. When the doors opened again, I was back on the ground floor. The air was warm, normal. The sounds of the hospital returned, distant voices, the soft hum of machines. I stumbled out, gasping, looking around frantically. Everything was exactly as it should be. No one else had noticed a thing. I turned back toward the elevator. The button panel was normal again. The number 6 was gone, as if it had never existed. I quit St. Mary's the next morning. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I dream of that floor. The dark hallway, the heart monitor, and the thing that sat up in the bed, waiting. I tried to forget. I really did. I moved to another hospital, changed my number, even left town. But the dreams never stopped. Every night, I was back there, on the 6th floor. The hallway stretched impossibly long, doors standing open like gaping mouths. The heart monitor always beeped, and the thing in the bed always sat up. Each time, it whispered the same words. "You don't belong here." But something changed. I started waking up at 2:06 a.m., the exact time I had stepped into that elevator. The first few times, I brushed it off as stress. Then one night, my phone buzzed. A hospital alert. But it wasn't from my new job. It was from St. Mary's. "Elevator malfunction, unauthorized stop, floor 6. I stared at the screen, my breath frozen in my chest. That place wasn't supposed to exist. Then, another message. "Patient record found, name match detected." A link appeared below it. My hand trembled as I tapped it. A scanned document loaded, grainy and old. A death certificate. Patient name, my name. Date of death, 2:06 a.m. Location, St. Mary's Hospital, 6th floor. The room around me seemed to shrink, the air turning stale and thick. My vision blurred. This had to be a mistake. I wasn't dead. I reached for my reflection in the window, and then I saw it. A faint, shadowy figure standing behind me. Gaunt. Charred. The thing from the bed. Its lips didn't move, but the whisper filled my ears, deafening, inescapable. "You don't belong here." The room plunged into darkness. And this time I knew. I was never waking up. I had worked the night shift at Fairview Hospital for years, and nothing about death scared me anymore. Patients came and went, some leaving with recovery, others wrapped in white sheets. It was part of the job. Then room 509 changed everything. The patient was admitted at 11:47 p.m. No name, no medical history, just a man in his 50s, unconscious, barely breathing. The chart listed no family, no next of kin. The paramedics who brought him in looked shaken, refusing to talk about where they had found him. His heart rate was dangerously slow. His skin was ice cold. We should have transferred him to the ICU, but every time someone suggested it, a power failure flickered through the hospital. The monitors glitched. The lights dimmed. The charge nurse, an older woman named Helen, muttered, "He stays here." No one argued. At 2:09 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I passed room 509. The door was open just a crack. The patient should have been unconscious, but he was sitting up in bed. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his chest barely rising. The heart monitor beside him blinked erratically. Too fast, then too slow, then completely wrong. I took a hesitant step inside. "Sir?" He turned his head toward me in a slow, jerking motion. His eyes were black. No whites, no pupils. Just bottomless voids. The beeping of the monitor stopped. The entire hospital seemed to go silent. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. A wide, impossible grin stretching too far, like his skin barely fit over his skull. I stumbled backward. My hand fumbled for my radio, but the static pouring from it was deafening. And then he spoke. His voice was layered, many voices speaking at once. "Not yet." The room plunged into darkness. The hospital alarm blared. Patients screamed down the hall. Lights flickered violently, as if the entire building was short-circuiting. I turned to run, but room 509 was gone. The bed, the monitors, the patient. Nothing but an empty room with walls covered in handprints, dark, smudged, pressed into every surface. And then I noticed. The prints weren't leading out. They were leading in. The power returned an hour later. The hospital went back to normal. But when we checked the records, there was no admission for room 509 that night. No patient matching his description. No paramedics had brought anyone in. But when I checked the security footage, my stomach turned to ice. At 2:09 a.m., the door to room 509 had opened on its own. And for exactly 13 seconds, the camera feed went completely black. I quit the next morning. But every night, at 2:09 a.m., my phone buzzes with a hospital alert. No number. No message. Just a room number. 509. I blocked the number. I changed phones. I even moved across the country. None of it mattered. At 2:09 a.m., the alerts kept coming. Each night, a new message. No words, just 509 flashing on my screen. At first, I ignored them. But then, things started happening. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. My bedroom door, which I always left open, would be shut when I woke up. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of antiseptic and something rotten. Then I started hearing it. A soft, rhythmic beeping. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But last night, it was inside my apartment. I followed the sound to my living room. And there, in the darkness, my TV flickered on. Security footage. A hospital hallway. The timestamp in the corner read 2:09 a.m. My stomach turned to ice. I recognized that hall. It was Fairview Hospital. Room 509's door stood slightly open. The footage was silent. Empty. The camera feed flickered with static. Then, the door opened wider, and something stepped out. Not a person. Not entirely. Its figure was tall, impossibly thin. Its face stretched in that same too-wide grin, eyes black as a void. It turned toward the camera. And then slowly, it turned toward me. My TV shut off. The beeping continued, behind me. I spun around. The darkness was thick, pressing in from every corner. The air felt heavy, like a hospital room sealed shut. A whisper brushed my ear, dry and layered, like many voices speaking as one. Time to check in. The lights burst. The last thing I saw was the number 509 flashing on my phone. And then, nothing. When I woke, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in a hospital bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic flooded my senses, and the steady beep of a heart monitor echoed through the room. My head felt heavy, disoriented. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, as if something was holding me down. I opened my eyes fully, my breath catching in my throat. I was in room 509, the same room from the footage. The same empty room I had seen so many times. The walls were the same, covered in the same handprints. They were still fresh, still wet with something dark, sticky. The door creaked open, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The thing stepped inside. Its face was the same, a grotesque, impossibly wide grin, eyes blacker than anything I had ever seen. It was taller now, its skin stretched tight across its skeletal frame, like it was no longer human, like it had never been. The heart monitor beside my bed beeped once, twice, too fast, and then flatlined. I couldn't breathe. It leaned down close, its lips brushing against my ear, sending a shiver of dread down my spine. "You've been checked in for a while now." I wanted to scream, to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped in this room, in this place, with no way out. It stood up, taking a step back. Its eyes never left mine. "Now you'll stay." The door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. The lights flickered once, then twice, and the steady beep of the heart monitor resumed. Only this time, it was my heartbeat. But I wasn't alive. I was just another patient in room 509. Forever. I've been working night shifts at Crestwood Hospital for years now, and I thought I had seen it all: sick patients, exhausted nurses, and the usual hospital noises. But last week, something happened that I can't quite explain. It's left me unsettled, though I'm trying my best to push it from my mind. It all started with room 217. Room 217 had always been tucked away in an older section of the hospital. It wasn't often used, and when it was more for storage than for patients. But that night, we had an emergency. A woman was brought in by ambulance, pale and breathing faintly. Her vitals were all over the place, and we didn't have any information on her. No paperwork, no family. She was a mystery. The paramedics left quickly, their faces tight, as though they were eager to be gone. I set her up within 4 and started monitoring her vitals, but something about the situation felt off. Every now and then, her heart rate would spike, only to drop again just as fast. It was unsettling, but I assumed it was stress or trauma. I had seen worse. But as the night wore on, things started to get stranger. The room temperature started to drop, slowly but noticeably. At first, I figured it was just the air conditioning, but even as I checked the thermostat, the numbers weren't matching up. It was as if the cold was coming from inside the room. Around 3 a.m., I stepped out to grab some coffee, but when I came back, the door to room 217 was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The woman was still lying in bed, but something had changed. Her hands, well, they didn't look like they should have. Her fingers were unnaturally long, stretched out like they had been held in one position for hours. It was almost as if her hands had aged, become more brittle. I blinked. Maybe I was just tired. I stepped closer to check her vitals, trying to dismiss the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard a whisper. "Help me." I froze, turning slowly toward the woman. Her lips hadn't moved, but the voice, it was faint, like a distant echo. I was sure I heard it, though. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I turned to leave the room, but before I could, I felt something brush my arm. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The woman was still lying there, her hands curled up as though she were sleeping. But her eyes were wide open, staring right at me. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over me. The lights flickered, and I glanced down at the heart monitor. The beeping was irregular, no longer steady. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I moved to adjust the settings on the machine, but when I touched the wires, the screen went completely flat. And then the voice again. "Get out!" I spun around, but this time, I didn't wait for an explanation. I bolted out of the room, my heart racing. As I ran down the hallway, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something follow me. The hospital was eerily quiet, more so than usual. As I passed the nurse's station, I noticed that no one was there. The silence was oppressive. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 4:15 a.m. I had only been gone for a few minutes. I turned to head back toward the break room, but then the lights flickered. The entire hallway plunged into darkness. That's when I heard the footsteps, soft and slow, almost dragging like someone or something was moving down the hall. I stopped dead in my tracks, but there was no one behind me. The hall was empty. I took a shaky breath and turned around to go the other way. And just as I did, I heard the voice one last time, closer now, almost in my ear. "You can't leave." I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. I rushed to find the nearest exit, but when I turned a corner, I saw her, the woman. Her body was twisted, her arms bent unnaturally, her fingers still long and unnerving. Her eyes were wide open, but there was something strange in them, something that didn't belong. She stared at me, and I felt that same chill run through my veins. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. And just as suddenly as it started, the lights came back on, and the woman was gone. I blinked, confused. Was it all just a hallucination? When I finally made it back to the nurse's station, I checked the patient records. Room 217 showed no patient admitted that night. No one had checked in, but when I looked at the patient log, there was something strange written at the bottom of the page. Patient left voluntarily. Please do not disturb. I stared at it for a moment, then shook my head. It was too late. I needed sleep. I needed to forget. As I left the hospital, the sensation of cold air seemed to linger, like a shadow following me. I haven't seen her since, but sometimes when I walk past the room late at night, I swear I can hear a whisper, soft and distant, just beyond the door. Help me. The whispers continued, growing fainter with each passing day. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lingering in the halls, waiting for me. One evening, weeks after the incident with room 217, I returned to work, weary from lack of sleep. I had almost convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that everything had been a result of exhaustion and stress. But something in the air felt different that night. The hospital was unusually quiet, too quiet for a place that was usually buzzing with activity. As I passed the hallway leading to the older section, I noticed the door to room 217 was slightly ajar. I stopped. For a moment, I was tempted to just walk away, to leave it be, and pretend I hadn't seen it. But some unexplainable force, pulled me toward it. I couldn't help it. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, but there on the far wall, written in what looked like black ink, no, something darker, was a message. I'm waiting. I gasped and stumbled back, my hands trembling as I grabbed for my phone. I was about to call someone when I heard it, a faint, low laugh. It echoed in the room, sharp and hollow, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I turned around, my blood running cold, and there, in the corner of the room, was the woman. Her form was twisted and elongated, her eyes gleaming with that same unnatural light. Her mouth stretched wide, wider than I thought was possible, revealing dark, jagged teeth. You shouldn't have come back. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lights flickered above me, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A shadow, standing right behind me, barely visible in the corner of my vision. The door slammed shut. The darkness swallowed the room, and then everything went silent. The next morning, when my shift ended, I was found standing in the hallway, disoriented and wide-eyed, as though I had just woken up from a long, unsettling dream. But it wasn't a dream. Room 217 was now locked, and there was no trace of the woman. The walls were clean, except for one thing, written in the same ink, smeared across the glass of the door. You're still mine. I never went back to that room, and I never will. But every night, I can feel it, the presence, waiting, watching, lingering in the corners of my mind. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear her voice, soft and cold, whispering through the silence. I'm still here. I had always believed hospitals were places of healing, filled with the quiet hum of machines and the occasional rush of emergency. But St. Augustine Hospital, where I had been transferred for my night shifts, was different. There was something wrong about it, something that made the air feel heavier, like it carried whispers just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just the building itself. St. Augustine was old, one of the oldest hospitals in the city, with long, dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The floors creaked even when no one was walking, and the shadows never quite settled where they should. But the strangest part was Wing C, a section of the hospital that had been closed for years. I had heard the rumors from the other nurses. They whispered about a patient who had gone missing there, about doctors who refused to talk about what had happened. No one liked to pass by the entrance to Wing C. The doors were locked, the windows covered in dust. Yet, every now and then, I swore I saw movement inside. I tried not to think about it, until the night my pager buzzed with an assignment for room 306. I frowned. That wasn't possible. Room 306 was in Wing C. No one had been assigned there in years. Thinking it was a mistake, I radioed the front desk, but the only response I got was static. I checked the schedule again, and my name was still listed under the assignment. I could have ignored it. I could have pretended I hadn't seen it. But something in my gut told me that if I didn't go, someone else would. And I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what that meant. So gripping my flashlight tightly, I made my way to the locked doors of Wing C, the forgotten wing. The air changed the moment I stepped inside. It was colder than the rest of the hospital, but not in a normal way. It was still like the air had been trapped in time. The smell of dust and antiseptic filled my nose, and my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I walked through the abandoned hallway. The rooms on either side were dark, their beds empty, their curtains drawn. Some of the monitors were still plugged in, their screens flickering with faint static, as if waiting for patients that would never return. I swallowed hard and continued toward room 306. As I reached the door, I hesitated. Something about the handle felt off, too warm, as if someone had just been holding it. I pushed it open. The room was intact, but there was something unsettling about it. The bed was made, pristine white sheets tucked in perfectly, but the heart monitor was on. It beeped steadily, as though a patient was hooked up to it. Only there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped forward slowly, cautiously, checking the floor stand. The bag was full. The chair beside the bed was slightly pulled out, like someone had been sitting there just moments before. And then, the beeping changed. The heart monitor skipped a beat, then another. It was reacting to something. I turned toward the doorway, ready to leave. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it. A whisper. "Nurse, please." I froze. The voice was soft, weak, like someone barely clinging to consciousness. It came from the bed, the empty bed. I turned back slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The sheets, once pristine, were wrinkled, as if someone had just moved. And then in the dim light I saw it. An imprint. A deep, unmistakable imprint in the mattress. Someone was lying there. I stumbled back, my hands trembling. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping fast. My breath came out in a mist. And then the bathroom door creaked open. A shadow moved inside. I should have run. I wanted to run, but something rooted me to the spot, something unnatural. The whisper came again, closer this time. "It hurts." The heart monitor flatlined. A sudden, suffocating silence filled the room. And then the worst sound of all. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps coming from the bathroom, stepping onto the cold tile. And then, a hand. Pale fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe, gripping it tightly. They were thin, bony, but they weren't human. I finally broke free from my paralysis. I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the old tile floor. As I reached the entrance to Wing C, I slammed into someone. "Nurse." "Hey, slow down." It was Dr. Carter, one of the senior physicians. His expression turned serious when he saw my face. "What happened?" he asked. I turned to point toward Wing C, to tell him that something was wrong, but the hallway was dark, the lights were off, and the door to Wing C was locked, as if it had never been opened. Dr. Carter frowned. "No one's been in there for years. Are you sure you're feeling okay?" I couldn't answer. I could still feel it, the cold, the lingering presence, and when I looked down at my shaking hands, I saw it, a single bloody fingerprint on my wrist. The next day, I checked the hospital records. Room 306 had been abandoned for a decade. The last patient? A woman who had disappeared without a trace. Her case was still open, and the last note in her file was chillingly simple. She just vanished. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what was in that room. But I do know one thing. Some nights, when I pass by the doors to Wing C, I still hear it. A faint, desperate whisper. "Nurse, please." Hospitals never truly sleep. Even in the dead of night, there's always a quiet hum of machines, the occasional footsteps of a doctor making rounds, or the distant murmur of voices in the break room. But some parts of the hospital feel different at night. Darker, quieter. I learned that the hard way. I was covering an overnight shift at St. Michael's Hospital, a place known for being understaffed and overworked. I didn't mind. I had worked enough night shifts to be used to the eerie stillness. But that night, something was off. It started with the elevator. A misdirected call. Around 2:45 a.m., I was on the 5th floor, checking patient charts. The hospital only had 6 floors, with the top one mostly unused. It had once been a psychiatric wing, but due to budget cuts, it had been shut down years ago. Now it was just a place for storage, its doors locked to everyone except a handful of staff. I had no reason to go up there, but then the elevator dinged. I glanced up from my workstation. The doors slid open. Empty. That wasn't the strange part. Elevators move on their own sometimes. Someone calls them and then changes their mind, or a staff member uses a key override. It happens, but when I turned back to my computer, my screen flickered. A new request appeared in my system. Patient transport, floor 6. That made no sense. There were no patients on floor 6. I picked up the hospital radio. Security. Did someone just request a transport on the 6th floor? Static. Then something else. A faint, garbled voice. It was too distorted to make out. I tried again. Security, come in. Is there anyone on the top floor? Nothing. And then, the elevator doors slid open again. The call button for floor 6 was already pressed. I didn't press it. The doors didn't close. I should have walked away. I wanted to walk away, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped inside. The 6th floor. The ride up was slow. Too slow. Hospitals have high-speed elevators, meant for emergencies, but this one moved as if it were struggling to climb. The overhead light flickered, casting brief moments of darkness inside the metal box. Then a sound. A whisper. Not words. Just a soft, dragging noise, like someone breathing right behind me. I turned. Nothing. I faced forward again, my pulse hammering. The elevator jerked suddenly, causing me to stumble. Then, ding. The doors slid open to pure darkness. The unused floor. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something I couldn't name. The hallway stretched forward, lined with empty patient rooms. No lights. No movement. But I wasn't alone. Somewhere down the hall, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound. Slow. Uneven. Like footsteps. I swallowed hard. Hello? My voice barely carried. The shuffling stopped. Then I saw it. Not a person. Not exactly. A figure, standing just beyond the dim glow of the elevator. Tall. Too tall. Its head tilted slightly as if listening. I took a step back. It took a step forward. That was all I needed. I lunged for the elevator panel, jamming the button for the ground floor. The figure moved. Fast. The lights flickered violently as the doors struggled to close. I caught a glimpse of long, reaching hands, fingers that weren't right. And then, darkness. The elevator plunged downward. I braced myself against the wall, heart pounding as the air grew colder and colder. My breath misted in front of me. The emergency light flickered weakly, casting brief flashes of the empty space around me. Except, it wasn't empty anymore. Something was in there with me. I felt it. A presence. Close. Breathing. Right against my ear. And then, a whisper. Not yet. The elevator slammed to a stop. The doors slid open. I stumbled out onto the first floor, gasping for air. The hallway was normal again. Bright, busy, filled with nurses and doctors going about their shifts. Like nothing had happened. I turned to look at the elevator. The doors were closing slowly, as if something inside had just let me go. I didn't move until I heard the final ding. When I finally stepped away, my radio crackled to life. Security to all staff. Please avoid using elevator 3. We're running a systems check. It went up to the 6th floor again. I didn't answer. I just walked away, and I never took that elevator again. The descent into madness. For days, I tried to convince myself that what happened in elevator 3 was just my imagination. Exhaustion, stress, maybe a brief malfunction. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been in there with me. Something not human. I avoided the elevator entirely, sticking to the stairs no matter how many flights I had to climb. But no matter where I went in the hospital, I felt it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. It started subtly. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. My ID badge would be on my desk, and moments later, I'd find it in my locker. Whispers floated through empty hallways, just on the edge of hearing. Every time I passed the closed doors of an unoccupied room, I had the overwhelming sensation that something was waiting on the other side. Then the calls started coming in. The room that didn't exist. One night, just after 3 a.m., I was updating patient records when the phone at the nurse's station rang. ICU, this is Rachel speaking. Silence. Then a voice. Soft. Weak. Desperate. Help me. My skin prickled. Who is this? What room are you in? A pause. Then, 418. My breath caught in my throat. Room 418 didn't exist. The hospital only had 4 floors in use, and I had seen the blueprints myself. No such room existed. I gripped the phone tighter. Who are you? Please, it's dark. The line went dead. The temperature around me dropped instantly. My breath misted in front of me, and I felt it again. That same cold, suffocating presence that I had felt in the elevator. I turned slowly. The hallway was empty, but in the reflection of the window across from me, I saw something standing behind me. A figure. Too tall. Too thin. Too wrong. The final descent. I don't remember running, but I found myself in the stairwell, my heart hammering in my chest. I gripped the railing, trying to catch my breath. Then, the lights flickered. The emergency alarm buzzed to life, but the sound was distorted, warping into something inhuman. And then, through the stairwell, I heard it. A voice. From the bottom floor. Whispering my name. I clutched my radio, my fingers shaking. Security. Is someone in the stairwell? Static. Then, a response. But it wasn't security. It was my own voice. Rachel, you need to come down. The world tilted. The hospital felt wrong, like the walls were stretching, twisting into something that shouldn't exist. My vision blurred as the voice, my voice, called again from the bottom of the stairs. Come down. It's waiting for you. Then, a shadow moved. Not like a normal shadow. It crawled, twisting along the stairwell walls like something alive, coming toward me. I turned, and I saw the elevator doors open. Inside, there was no floor, just an endless, yawning black abyss. And then, something pulled me in. The final record. I woke up in a hospital bed, disoriented, lightheaded. The doctors told me they had found me in the basement, lying in the old records room. No one knew how I had gotten there. I don't remember. At least, I try not to. But ever since that night, something has been wrong. Reflections don't look quite right. My shadow sometimes moves when I don't. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., my hospital pager buzzes with a request. Patient transport, floor 6. The hospital doesn't have a 6th floor, but I know it's there, and it's waiting for me to come back.